All right, excellent. So today we're going to talk about managing security and controls in NetSuite. These are topics that I think all companies should know. And who am I? My name is Amanda Barker. Let me go ahead and put this in presentation mode. All right, very good. Hopefully you guys can see that. Okay, so my name is Amanda Barker. And I am a director in our financial operations practice with Connor Group. I specialize in NetSuite security and controls, and I have spent the last several years helping all kinds of clients think about security and controls in NetSuite. I focus on companies that are having some kind of IPO activity. Either they're newly public or they're thinking about going public, and they want to make sure that they have the right security and controls in their NetSuite environment. Prior to joining Connor Group, I actually spent 10 years with PwC, and I did IT audit at PwC for a number of years early in my career. And so that background, I think, has given me a great perspective on what auditors are looking for. And that I use to help my clients, figure out how do we make sure we have the right controls in place when it comes time to be audited. So before we dive into that, I'd love to just know who we have on the call with us today. So maybe using the raise your hand feature or the chat, would love to know just your experience with NetSuite. So if you're relatively new to NetSuite, if you could raise your hand if this is something, within the last maybe year or 2 years, relatively new to NetSuite. Okay. All right. Dennis, Isabella. Okay, got it. Fantastic. Peter, I see you. Okay. And if you are more experienced with NetSuite, if you've got maybe more than 2 years of experience with NetSuite, raise your hand. Okay, so everyone's relatively new, it seems like, to NetSuite, so that's great. And then the other question I had was, I just want to understand kind of what your role is in the organization. So if you are more on the finance, accounting, internal audit side of the house, if you could raise your hand. Hi, Isabella. Okay. Great. And if you are more on the IT side of the house, could you raise your hand if you're maybe an administrator or a developer? Stephen, Dennis, I see you. Okay, fantastic. All right, great. So I hope that today we'll cover, a number of things that you find useful. If you have questions, please throw them in the chat. I will try to answer them in real time. There's also time at the end of the presentation for questions as well. All right, so with that, what are we going to cover today? So first of all, I want to help you understand why you should care about IT controls in NetSuite. And then we're going to talk about what are some common challenges that companies encounter within their NetSuite environments. And then we're going to get into some really detailed examples, some tangible things that I hope that you can take away from this presentation and go and implement today or very soon within your company and within your environment. All right. So why should we care about IT controls? So IT controls are the foundation of your overall control environment. So the systems that generate our financial reports, the systems that process our data, that store our master data, these are the systems that we rely on in order to have accurate and reliable financial statements. So without proper IT controls, and in the audit world, you might hear the term ITGCs or IT general controls. That's what we're talking about here. So really we want to understand, who has access to the system, how are changes made to the system, computer operations. So these are things like batch jobs and interfaces, and then any system development lifecycle controls. So when new systems are implemented, are they following a good process? So IT controls help us achieve financial objectives. Obviously, we're talking about completeness, accuracy, validity, authorization, right? Good, reliable data and reports. And then they also help us achieve operational objectives. So things like confidentiality, integrity, effectiveness, and efficiency. So the IT controls are really the foundation by which the whole rest of your organization kind of sits on. And without proper IT controls, if you're going through an audit, or maybe you've been through an audit previously, if you're not able to rely on a system, meaning you don't have good controls over, for example, who has access to the system or how changes are made, for example, without those good controls and being able to rely on them, you're going to have to perform a lot of additional substantive procedures in order to validate that the information that's coming from the system is accurate and reliable. And that can be a real headache. So getting this right is going to set you up for success when it comes to an audit, and when it comes to producing reliable data that everyone in your organization can trust. So when we think about NetSuite is extremely flexible. And a lot of companies like it because it's relatively easy to set up. There's the suite success methodology for implementation, and that makes it really easy and quick to get your instance stood up and to get going, to get processing transactions, doing business, all the things that you need to do to run your company, right? But when it comes to controls, I see three main issues that a lot of companies struggle with. So the first is related to security. NetSuite comes delivered with a number of roles that you can assign to users. The problem is that these roles were designed a long time ago. So they're based on an outdated framework, and a lot of the roles contain way too much access. And they also contain segregation of duties risk, meaning that a single role by itself is actually granting access to both sides of an SOD conflict. So that in and of itself presents a huge challenge, because to create custom roles for your organization can be challenging. You have to understand what are the permissions that give people access, and you have to put in the time to test those out and to right size that to your organizational needs. So that's a challenge. As a result of this challenge, what I often see is a lot of companies end up giving everyone administrator access, because it does take time to create those custom roles, and why bother when administrator just has everything? Or they give users multiple roles at the same time, because they just keep trying and granting access until the users get the roles that they need. Or they leverage global permissions. Either way you slice it, what this kind of amounts to is that users end up with way more access than they need. And that is obviously a risk if you're trying to create a good environment where you can rely on your transactions and the authority and the validity of the transactions that are created. And the last thing here that I'll note related to security is I do often see, especially with newly implemented NetSuite environments, that oftentimes someone in accounting or finance ends up owning the application to begin with. And that's really not ideal, especially if you're trying to become a public company. It's best practice to have IT own an application like your ERP, just to really make sure that we're segregating, the transactional business side of things from the IT side of things, right? You don't want somebody who can create journal entries and then also go and modify system settings. That's not going to be a good scenario. The second challenge that I see is that controls are often an afterthought. when you're implementing a system like NetSuite. So as I said, the suite success methodology for implementation allows you to set up the system pretty quickly, but controls and compliance really is not a work stream that's included in that suite success methodology. And so what that means is that companies who only utilize suite success and don't really take the time to think about controls end up underutilizing the capabilities of NetSuite. So there are a lot of opportunities to automate, to use the system to enforce things like SOD, workflows, approvals and things like that. And without careful consideration and thoughtful design, those things are often missed. And so you end up with, a lot of time consuming manual controls. And you may have control deficiencies because there are system loopholes that aren't closed properly. And then kind of leading into the third challenge here is that a lot of those, customizations or controls that are used to automate or to enforce approvals and things like that do require customization. Unfortunately, NetSuite does not provide a lot of sort of checkbox, easy to implement control configurations. So it does require some knowledge of suite flow and suite script and things like that. And so as a result, a lot of companies end up purchasing third-party bundles, or they will hire third-party vendors to come in and perform those customizations. The quality of work with that type of solution obviously varies greatly depending on who you've hired. And then if you have a lot of, customizations that have been done in different ways to your system, over time, that can lead to issues with performance. It can slow your system down and can really create a lot of issues just with users trying to get in and do their day-to-day jobs. So with that, let's do a quick knowledge check here. So in the chat, if you could just answer this question. So what is the most common issue that we talked about today that customers run into when it comes to compliance? Is it that delivered roles contain SOD conflicts, controls such as workflows don't come delivered with the product, or is it C, that custom roles require special NetSuite experience and they're often not part of the implementation? All right, got some answers coming in. Yes, it looks like everyone's got it. Awesome. So it is D. It's all of the above and more potentially, but these are the most common issues that we tend to run into. So awesome. Yes, D is the correct answer. Okay, so let's dive into some very specific solutions. How can we address some of these problems? So first and foremost, let's talk about journal entries. So journal entries, and you will know this if you've been through an audit, but journal entries often get the most scrutiny in an audit because they are the biggest opportunity where fraud can occur, particularly executive fraud, where we're able to create top-side entries, we're able to kind of manipulate the balances and things like that. So journal entries get a lot of scrutiny. The issue with journal entries is that out of the box, users can create and approve their own journals, okay? And journals can be modified after they've been posted. So if that doesn't sound like a problem to you, then go ahead and use the journal entry functionality out of the box. But for most companies, this is a big issue, and it really amounts to a major gap and an ability to essentially circumvent controls. So how do we fix this? Well, the thing that I recommend all of my clients do is enable journal entry workflow. Now, the issue is that NetSuite doesn't really provide you with an out-of-the-box journal entry workflow. So it's something that you're going to have to download a custom bundle and configure that to your environment. And NetSuite does provide this bundle that you can download and install. It's relatively easy, but I recommend making sure that it's configured to your specific environment and to your specific control needs. within this workflow, it's really important that you make sure that the same user cannot both create and approve their own journal. And this is important because depending on the size of your organization, you may have individuals who need the ability to both create and approve their own journal, right? And that is okay as long as they're not doing it to the same journal, right? Yes, so yeah, exactly. Renato, I'm seeing your chat here. Yes, so by installation, so, and what I mean by that is if you have a user that has both of the permissions, obviously you need the permissions to be able to create and approve your own journal. But if you have both the create and the approve journal, then yes, you can go ahead and you can create and approve to your heart's content. So that's really, we don't want users to be able to do that. So workflow will allow you to prevent someone from doing that on the same journal. And then in the workflow, also, you want to make sure that once that journal is submitted for approval, that the approver doesn't also have the ability to go and modify the journal. Because if they could, then that's very similar to actually being able to create and approve your own journal, right? They can modify, they can, edit a field, they can edit the amount, they can change the GL code, right? We don't want them to be able to do that. You want to also make sure that the workflow includes all of your manual journal sources. So that is also, any journals that are uploaded via CSV, as well as allocation entries. You may have custom transaction types in your environment that allow people to create custom journals. Make sure that those are included if that's the case. And then last but not least, ensure that the workflow locks the record after it's been approved. Without this last final step, a journal can be modified after it's been approved. Somebody with the journal creation permission can go in and actually modify that journal. So those are the best practices for journal entry workflow. Let's look at just really quickly. I like this slide because it kind of demonstrates some different ways that you can mitigate journal entry risk. Okay, so the upper left-hand box here, as we said, out of the box, users can approve their own journals and they can modify journals before they're approved as well. So there's a lot of opportunity for error or fraud within that process. Some companies may opt to do a more traditional manual review control. And this is where maybe you have a report that you generate that looks to see who are the creator and the approver of the journal. You can look to see what the last modified date is of the journal and whether or not that comes after the approval date. So that is an option if you don't, for whatever reason, want to implement workflow or you're not able to implement workflow. But it can be a very cumbersome process, and it's also detective, right? So by the time you're performing this review, those transactions have already been created and you need to go and unwind them or figure out what happened. It can be a lot of extra effort on your end. So the best practice is this, the sweet flow box here on the right-hand side that depicts how the journal entry is locked. The creator cannot modify, and the approver also cannot modify. And you can have it set up as well where, let's say somebody needs to modify the journal after it's been submitted. You can have it sent back through the approval routing, or you can have it route to someone else. So if that's a functionality that you need, the sweet flow, thankfully, is pretty flexible to allow for any type of business scenario that you need. Okay. Let's go to a knowledge check here. So what is the best way to mitigate the risk associated with journal entries, the ability to create and post entries in NetSuite? So A, the journal entry workflow that prevents create and post on the same record and locks the record. B, ensuring that you have appropriate segregation of duties within user roles. C, a manual review control at the end of the month, or D, NetSuite just takes care of this out of the box, so you don't need to worry about it. Yes, okay. Yes, the correct answer is A, and Matt, I totally agree with you. D would also be very nice if it just did that. Okay, yes, the correct answer is A. Awesome. Right. Okay, I'm going to move on now to the procure-to-pay cycle. And let's talk about fraud risk related to vendors and payments. So again, this is something that NetSuite doesn't provide out of the box. It's something that you'll need to think about how you custom configure this for your environment. But without any controls in place, I just want to highlight that this is a real fraud opportunity area. The ability to create and modify vendors and also make payments to those vendors is a risk for any company, regardless of the application that you're working with. It's just important to understand within NetSuite, how do we address this risk, right? So let me just make sure on the chat. Why does Oracle not remediate that? So Renato, with journal entries, the idea is to give you as the customer the flexibility to design a SuiteFlow process that is custom to your needs. So I think that, if they force everyone into the same SuiteFlow or the same process, in terms of how journals get routed and who can approve and all of that, I think that it would defeat some of the design idea around wanting customers to have flexibility in that. I do wish that there was more that was sort of provided out of the box, at least the building blocks. It's a great question, and I think it's something that comes up quite a bit. And so, if you have the opportunity to talk to your customer representative or log, a service request or what do they call it? A wish list essentially of features and functionality, that in my mind would be number one. But as to why, I don't work for NetSuite, I wish I knew why. It would be the first thing that I would design if I was in charge. So. Okay, cool. Just wanted to make sure I didn't see any other questions. All right, great. So sorry, back to fraud risk and vendors and payments. So this is another opportunity where SuiteFlow or workflow, those two terms are interchangeable, where we can enforce an approval process to make sure that this is well controlled. Again, you do have the option to have a detective review control here, and maybe that's feasible in the short term while you work on implementing some kind of workflow. But I would really recommend having some kind of preventive workflow in place to really make sure that we're locked down on that risk. So the first workflow solution that I would recommend is a solution to enforce approval on changes to vendors, changes or additions to your vendor master. Now, keep in mind that not every record on your vendor master is necessarily carries the same risk associated with it, right? So you might want to design a workflow that really looks at when certain key fields are changed, right? So I'm thinking like bank accounts, right? Or the name of the vendor, maybe the address of the vendor. But there are other fields on the vendor record that don't matter as much, or maybe don't even matter at all. So you don't necessarily want to create a process that's so cumbersome that every time, a tiny little change is made that has no financial impact, you don't need all of that to go through an approval process. The second workflow that I would recommend here is a workflow over vendor bill payments. And this is to ensure that payments that are made to valid vendors and that they are made for valid goods and services that have been received. Now, you can implement some kind of 2- or 3-way match here to kind of help with this process. So either of those options, I think, are good. again, you might want to consider like what's the volume of vendor payments that we're making. Are certain vendors riskier than others? Maybe there's a threshold that we can apply where payments under a certain amount, don't require all the approvals, or maybe they require no approvals. And then over a certain amount, maybe you need 2 or 3 approvers. Just depends on your organization, your risk tolerance, and what types of vendors are you interacting with, right? Are there certain vendors that carry more risk with them versus others potentially? So some things to watch out there with vendors and payments. Okay. Oh, I see we've got a chat. How to most claims. Okay. So Renato, good question. How do we identify all the workflows that exist in NetSuite? Most clients do not know how to pull a population of changes by type. Yeah, so this is a very common thing that I run into as well. So under the customization menu of NetSuite, you can go into, there's a menu called workflow. And from there, if you have the right access to see that page, you should get the inventory of all of the workflows that are existing in your account. Workflows that are provided from third-party bundles, you would have to get that from the Suite App Store. And you can search by functionality, you can search by vendor within there to see, what are the options that work for you. So that's the answer to your first question. In terms of pulling a population of changes, we're going to get into that actually in just a second here. So let me come back to that question. So change management. So change management is, I would say, first of all, it's an area where the audit requirements have changed a lot over time, and to the detriment of my clients, because the auditors are wanting more and more evidence every time, basically. So we're increasing the burden of companies to demonstrate compliance here. Now, NetSuite obviously has the audit log or the system notes, and that can be both a blessing and a curse, right? Because the system notes are keeping track of all changes, but not all changes are subject to what we think about in terms of a change management control. A couple of other challenges when it comes to NetSuite and change management is obviously, the administrator role has access to everything, and you cannot tailor that role or take away access from that role. So somebody's going to have that access. That is not necessarily a unique risk to NetSuite. Every system that exists in every system. Someone has God access in every system, right? And then, but the challenge with NetSuite, I would say, is just the inability to segregate the ability to develop a change and then deploy a change, right? So your administrator can go in and make any change they want, anytime they want. There's nothing to systematically enforce, that somebody else has reviewed, approved, tested that change before it goes into production. So what do we do about this? There are a number of different things that we can do together to create a more robust change management environment. So the first thing that I always recommend is restricting your administrator role so that we're just focused on IT users, right? No one in accounting or finance should have administrator access. Period. End of story. If you feel differently, we can fight about it, but that is my absolute hard line. The second thing is that you should have a process in place to log all changes. So this is like a Jira system or a ServiceNow ticketing system, something to that effect, right? Where people by process need to go in, they need to request a change, describe the nature of the change, and it needs to flow through an appropriate approval and testing process. Now, in NetSuite, there are different types of changes that can be made. So not every change needs to be going through the exact same, robust UAT and related testing, right? There may be checkbox configurations that maybe they don't require testing, versus suite script changes require a lot of testing. So you should have a policy in place that really describes, like, here are the different types of changes that we make, and here is the different level of testing that's required for each one. And you should also think about how do emergency changes get handled, and to make sure that there are appropriate procedures in place if you ever need to make an emergency change. Now, the next thing is that because of that administrator role, and the fact that it has access to everything, you do want to implement some kind of activity monitoring control to make sure that admins aren't creating or modifying transactions or master data unless there is an approved ticket asking them to do so. Now, thankfully in NetSuite, this is relatively easy to do thanks to saved searches and the system notes audit trail. So the other thing to note here too is, like, we shouldn't boil the ocean, right? So let's focus on what are the key things that we really don't want admins to do, right? Admins should not be creating or modifying journal entries. They should not be creating or modifying vendors or customers. They shouldn't be creating or initiating payments. They shouldn't be creating sales orders, like those types of things. So you can create a system note save search on those particular object types, and focused on the administrators or the users that have administrator to understand what they have done. There are tools out there that can help you with this. Fastpath has the ability to implement this monitoring control as well, so that the question that was raised about creating a search related to changes, this can be very helpful. That a tool like Fastpath can be helpful for that. Next, you want to have some kind of periodic review of your changes. Right now, when we're talking about changes, I'm talking about changes that IT should make. So these are system configuration type changes. Not every change in the system is going to fall under this umbrella. So when I'm talking about change management, I'm referring to things like workflows, scripts, custom objects, enable features, bundles. At a high level, that's, reports maybe fall into that. Changes to roles, I would also include in there. But that's really it, right? So again, you can create a system note save search to pull these objects, to pull changes to these objects, and then you want to cross-reference this with your ticketing system to make sure that all of those objects have an appropriate ticket. Now, if that sounds like kind of an arduous manual task, it is. And I know that it's not like no one wants to do this, but just understand that your auditor is going to want to see this. They're going to want to know, how do you know that nobody went around your ticketing system process and created a change that they shouldn't have? And so this is the only way to demonstrate that, right? Is to pull this list of changes and to tie it back to your ticketing system. My recommendation would be, again, to use some kind of third-party tool. Fastpath has a feature that can allow you to do this in real time. So my recommendation would be to have somebody looking at this like on a weekly basis, so that, at the end of the quarter or the end of the month or whatever, you're not trying to sift through like a whole long list of changes, because that can be a very arduous task. Last but not least, when it comes to change management, make sure that you have a process in place to test and review vendor managed changes. So here I'm talking about the semi-annual NetSuite updates that are pushed. Now, I've had companies in the past tell me, well, NetSuite manages those. I don't have control over it. But that's really not the right answer, especially if you're a public company and subject to an audit. You do need to have a process in place where you're at least looking at the review notes and understanding what is in here that could break in my system. Are there new features and functionality that I need to be aware of? And this is really important if you have a lot of customizations in your system, because the more customizations you have, more likely it is that one of these semi-annual releases is going to break something in your system. So you need to look at it, and you should document that you looked at it and that you did some kind of testing related to it. But don't just do nothing. That's not the right answer. Okay, let's do a knowledge check. So what is the best way to mitigate the risk associated with administrator access in NetSuite? Right, got some answers coming in. Matt, Jenna, Peter, Renato. Yes, you got it. It's E. E is the right answer. All of the above. And I think all of these controls work together to tell that story about why you have a robust control over change management. Good stuff. Okay, let's talk about integrations and interfaces. So when you're thinking about your control environment within NetSuite, it is important to understand what are all of the boundary systems that feed into NetSuite as well. And how do you ensure that data is coming into NetSuite completely and accurately, right? So there are a couple of considerations here. One is that to facilitate these integrations, oftentimes you need to have some kind of integration account that facilitates the API connection and then uses that account to write data into your NetSuite account. Really understand like what permissions does that integration account have, and ensure that end users cannot log into that account, particularly if that account is given administrator rights. I would argue that it's better to have a tailored role given to those integration accounts that doesn't, that basically only gives it the access that it needs, rather than giving it administrator. I understand sometimes that's not possible, but, controlling those accounts, if you can make them web services only accounts so that end users can't even see or log into them, that is really good practice. And then think about whether or not an iPaaS solution like Workato or Delboomi might be useful to help you with API management and with monitoring your interfaces, right? So your auditor is going to ask questions like, how do you know that the batch jobs that facilitate these interfaces and integrations are running completely and accurately? Are you monitoring them for failures? Do you get alerts? Does someone have to go and fix something, or are they self-healing? Those are some things to think about. And I would just encourage you to understand, like, what are all of the data sources that come into NetSuite? And how do we know that we're getting complete and accurate data? That's really the question. Okay, let's talk about security. So we've touched on a couple of different security concepts within NetSuite, but I just kind of want to highlight the different components to security in terms of roles and permissions, global permissions, and data access. So I've kind of drawn up this map here where you can see how a user gets access to a role. In this case, he's a GL accountant. He also gets assigned a certain subsidiary access. So in this case, he can only see the North America subsidiary. So this data access affects all of the other transactions that he's able to see. So when he logs in and creates journals or searches for journals, he can only see the ones that are related to North America. He also here, in his role of GL accountant, has been assigned the permission make journal entry. And under make journal entry, he has the ability to make a journal entry and also search for journal entries. Now, it's important to note here that he is also assigned this global permission of approve journal entry. So this is a permission that is given to him outside of his role, and it adds extra access to what he can do. So even though the role itself, GL accountant, does not have the ability to create and approve a journal, because of his global permission assignment, he can both create and approve a journal. So the risk with global permissions is that I often see companies kind of forget that they're being used. And when you run a report of users and roles, global permissions don't show up in that report. So if you're reviewing users and roles, you might miss that level of access that users have from that report. So something to watch out for. A couple of other ways that users can get access. You can hard code roles and users into scripts and workflows. So that's, if you're going to pull a report of users and roles, it's not going to show that level of permission either. So if you've hard coded something into a workflow, you could hard code your journal entry workflow to say route approval to journals to the GL accountant role. And you would never see that in a report. If you generated a roles and permissions report, it wouldn't show up. So something to watch out for. Core administrator permissions or privileges is another way that you can give a bit of elevated access to a role. This is a checkbox setting on a role. And this is sort of NetSuite's attempt to start to break up some of the functionality associated with that administrator role, which you cannot modify. But the core administrator privileges essentially elevate whatever permissions you have already existing in that role. It elevates that set to admin. So if you have access to just the invoices area of NetSuite, for example, and you get the core administration permission, now you're an admin in that area, but only in that area, not anywhere else in the system. So that can be used for good or bad, but it can be powerful depending on what you're using it for. A couple of other ways to restrict access, the audience setting for reports is a good way to, if there's data or certain reports that you don't want everyone to see, you can restrict it at the audience level. And then another way that you can also control security is through custom forms and form security. One thing to note though is if, for example, on a form, you hide a field in that form from view, that doesn't mean that the user can't go and create a saved search and see that data. It just means that on the form itself, they might not have the ability to enter data and they can't see it on the form, but it doesn't mean that they can't go and look at that information elsewhere if they have the right permissions. All right, so we've already talked a little bit about the administrator role, and I just mentioned about core administration permissions, but all of these issues with administrator, the fact that it can't be modified, at least one person needs to have access to this role. It has some inherent, it has all of the SOD conflicts basically, as well as, within change management, you can develop and deploy changes. So there's a lot of risk associated with this role. And a lot of the things we've already covered today are specifically designed to address some of this risk. But just, make sure you know who your admins are. And if you have finance and accounting folks that have administrator access, I would just encourage you to really understand why. Why do they need that access? What are they using it for? And what I've found is that oftentimes users kind of inherit that access and they like that access because it allows them to see a lot of things in the system. But they're not really using it, right? Like they're not really going in and creating workflows or different things like that. So it is a bit of a balance, removing that access, giving them a tailored role that's really fit for their purpose. But that is crucial to get right. If you've got too many admins or people who can do everything in the system, you're well on your way to some kind of significant deficiency or potentially material weakness in your audit. All right. So just a quick knowledge check. What is a global permission? A, something bad that should never be used. B, a permission that is assigned directly to a user. C, similar to the administrator role. Or D, a type of view-only access. Yes, the correct answer is B. E. Maybe that was from the last poll. Oh, I think that was from the last poll. Yeah, so B is the right answer. It's a permission that is assigned directly to a user. Okay. I know we're coming up on time here, so I'm going to go through the next couple of slides. So we've talked a little bit about, most of these concepts already related to user access, but, creating custom roles that are tailored to your company's needs, that utilize the principle of least privilege, I think is critical for setting the foundation to good controls in your environment. Ensuring that roles don't have inherent segregation of duties conflicts is also really important. So this is making sure that a single role by itself isn't giving you both sides of the SOD conflict. Now, in some cases that might be really difficult to do, just given the size of your organization. And what I would say is that it's going to be really useful to have some kind of a GRC tool to help you monitor that on an ongoing basis. So no company that I've ever worked with has zero SOD conflicts, but it's important to understand where you have conflicts if they are required in your environment, and to just make sure that you have appropriate mitigating controls and procedures around whatever that risk is, right? The other thing that a GRC tool can help you do is to understand, when you're doing a user access review, for example, it's important to not just look at the name of the role itself, because that can be misleading. You can name a role whatever you want to, right? Just because it says it's named inquiry does not actually mean that it is only read-only access. So that's important. And then the last thing here that I'll just highlight is, like we talked about with global permissions, I would say global permissions by themselves aren't really good or bad, but making sure that if you are using them, that you remember to look at them and that you remember to monitor them on an ongoing basis to make sure that whoever has those permissions is appropriate. All right, quick knowledge check here. What is good practice when designing custom roles in NetSuite? A, using the principle of least privilege. B, avoiding inherent SOD conflicts. C, leveraging a GRC tool. D, making sure inquiry responsibilities are truly read-only. Or E, all of the above. Yeah, the correct answer is E. You got it. Awesome. Okay, so the last thing here that I want to just cover very briefly is SOC reports. So SOC reports, if you have a lot of SaaS applications in your environment, you may or may not be aware of and or responsible for reviewing SOC reports. But a SOC report is essentially an attestation of controls that exist in your vendor's environment. So NetSuite provides you with a SOC report that says, hey, at NetSuite, we have appropriate controls in place to make sure that the people who have access to our system are appropriate, that the way that we make changes to NetSuite as an application is appropriate, and things like that, right? So that kind of allows you to take some comfort over the fact that, because there's a piece of the NetSuite world that you as a customer don't have any access to, right? You can't modify the source code. You can't control who within NetSuite gets access to their internal development tools and things like that, right? So that's what the SOC report does. But what I want to just emphasize here today is that reviewing a SOC report should not just be a checkbox exercise. And this is applicable not only to NetSuite, but really, to any SaaS application or vendor that you're utilizing. But it's important to understand, where does the responsibility at the vendor start and end? And where does your responsibility as a customer really begin? So one of the biggest areas that I kind of see this come up in is as it relates to change management. So NetSuite obviously is responsible for developing and deploying, the overall NetSuite application, right? But you as a customer have quite a bit of flexibility in terms of how you can change and update your own version. You can extend the functionality of your own version of NetSuite. And so just because NetSuite provides you with a SOC report doesn't mean that you're not responsible for monitoring your own environment and for having good controls in your own environment, right? And even like we were talking about the vendor managed changes that the semi-annual releases that NetSuite pushes. Yes, NetSuite should have a process in place where they test those changes, but they are not responsible for understanding how those changes are going to impact your specific NetSuite environment. So really important distinction there. And then understand, like, are there any exceptions in the report and how do they impact you? If you're relying on that third party to have good controls and then for whatever reason they don't, what additional procedures do you as a customer need to perform in order to really get comfortable with the environment or the data, right, that's coming out of that system ultimately. So this topic is broader than just NetSuite itself, but it comes up a lot. And I often find that, reviewing SOC reports for a lot of people tends to be kind of a checkbox exercise, throw it over the fence to the auditor or to internal audit. And it really, we should be doing a little bit deeper review here to make sure that the risks that we care about are covered. All right. So with that, we've got a few minutes here. We've got about 5 minutes. So I will answer some questions. Pulling a listing of changes in NetSuite. Let me see if there are no other questions. I can pull up my NetSuite environment and kind of show you how that would work. Here and okay, all right, so let me share my screen. And again, this is going to be a quick and dirty demonstration, but just briefly to kind of show you how you might go about this. So I would create a new search and I would go down here to system notes. I'm going to create a save search. And then I can go to record type and I can pick the records that I want. So let's say I want to look at, let's see, I can pick anything in here and it's going to give me changes. So let's see, I think I skipped it. Let me find. Flow. Okay, so say I just want to look at changes to workflow, but I could add, I could add custom records, I could add roles. In fact, let me just do that really quick. So I'm going to add role Sorry if I'm making anybody dizzy with the scrolling. MNOP, roll. And it's important that you hit the control button when you select more than one so that it pulls both of those things. But I just hit run here and now I can see what's the record that was changed, who changed it, the date, the old value, the new value. So this is a role. So admin access view only, that was changed. So we had a lot of roles essentially that were changed here. If I wanted to just see it, this is a demo environment that I have, so I'm not sure what changes to workflow were made, but let me just take out the role and make it just workflow, and let's just see what comes up here. Okay, so there were some changes to workflow. They're kind of old, 2018. There were a few that happened earlier this year, but that is a really simplified way of how you do it. And you can obviously add more fields in here if you want more information, but that's kind of a quick and dirty demo. Does that answer your question? Awesome. Okay. What else? Any other questions, guys? I know we just have one more minute left. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I'll put my email in the chat. Thank you so much for joining me today and for participating in all of my quiz questions. I appreciate that. Hopefully you got something out of the session today, something you can go and take away to your organization. And yeah, thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day.